Jenny. All right. Is it working? Oh, there it goes. Okay. Why bother, right? Very good. Oh. It is number 4. Remember the train? Instead of going to Mary's class, maybe she just sit in the 10:50.
I would love to.
You're welcome to. Oh, good point. Huh? What?
What was 10:50?
Anatomy? No, anatomy and physiology.
Whatever.
Excellent. Brad. Okay. Remember that we do have this ABG case study that is due at some point. There should be 2 blood gases with some intervention between them. So I got a blood gas. I needed to make a change. I made a change. Here's the follow-up blood gas. Okay. I don't know, sometime in November.
Oh, okay.
It's
our own patients.
correct. Yeah. I mean, that's why I'm doing it towards the end. Okay, pH. Remember, it's a negative logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration. We know that the hydrogen ion concentration is an extremely small value within the blood, and that's why we use it as we look at it logarithmically, because the value itself is so small. Doubling the hydrogen ion will only change the pH by about 0.3. So you can see it's a very small change that happens, but because it's such a small scale, we look at it logarithmically. And it's a negative relationship because as the concentration goes up, the pH falls. And in case you haven't been told, the normal pH in the arterial system is 7.35 to 7.45. We know that going in either direction, profound acidosis, profound alkalosis will cause death. So obviously we try to keep it in a very narrow range. And here's just some examples. The blood itself that we utilize or that we analyze is actually slightly on the alkaline side, but it's still considered that normal value. And you can see that as you go towards the acidic side, towards the alkaline side, there's all kind of various things there. Technically, an acid is something that's as a substance that's allowed or allows for a release of a hydrogen ion, and a base is the opposite. It's somebody that accepts that hydrogen ion, and ideally, what ends up happening is that there's this maintenance of an environment that is in control. That's homeostatic, and we do this homeostasis of pH by the lungs, the kidneys, and the blood buffers. Together, if you're looking at it, there's very limited amount of acid that is excreted through the kidneys. There is some, but not a lot. Far more is excreted through the lungs, with that acid specifically being carbonic acid. Okay. Carbonic acid is really the only volatile acid that is in the body. It's volatile because it can be converted from a liquid to a gaseous form, which is what it ends up doing, coming out of the CO2 that's transported in the plasma, then is transferred to the alveoli to be excreted off. The fixed acids, on the other hand, can't be converted to a gas, can't be excreted through the lungs, only can be processed through the kidneys and excreted in the urine. Therefore, it's a much more limited amount of acids that can be removed. This is the bicarbonate buffering system on top, and this is considered an open system because it's open in the sense that part of the byproducts are excreted through the lungs. On the other hand, the non-bicarbonate buffering system, where something else is buffering hydrogen ions, say perhaps hemoglobin, that mechanism basically just buffers that hydrogen ion, but it doesn't necessarily excrete it. It just ties it up and converts it to a hydrogen ion at that point, and until which time it can be bonded with with sodium bicarbonate, and then carbonic acid can dissociate the CO2 and water and be excreted. There is a relative relationship between bicarbonate and carbonic acid. Any rise in carbonic acid will yield a rise in CO2. It just kind of goes hand in hand with each other. And we can use that blood CO2 level, the PCO2, if you will, to be an index of carbonic acid. You know that converting between the two, where carbonic acid is expressed in milliequivalents per liter, we just multiply the PCO2 in millimeters of mercury times 0.03. We'll convert it then into carbonic acid. So if I have, probably should write this in. If I have a PaCO2 of 40, I take that 40 millimeters of mercury times 0.03, and I have 1.2 milliequivalents per liter of H2CO3. Does that vaguely sound familiar? Whatever you say, Rick. We're just here for the ride. Except for Luke. You know, Luke and Dana. Oh my, there's a bunch of them. Luke's a dog. So the plasma bicarbonate system is, again, the one that we see the most involved, in the sense that this is what effect one of the primary buffers is the plasma bicarbonate. Yes?
You have two, and ours is one, because it's one or two on the bottom.
Two.
It's in the red, so it's two.
That's right. If you take a look at that table that is there for every 10 torr change in PCO2, you have a 0.08 change in pH. There's a big table I blew up for you. I think it's 2. It's supposed to be there. So let's say I go from a PCO2 of 40 normally to a PCO2 of 60 acutely. Okay. What will end up happening is that increase in PCO2 in the bloodstream, this is my plasma, here's my erythrocyte, that 60 PCO2 is going to equilibrate with the intracellular fluid, right? So this intracellular PCO2 will rise. When that ends up happening, the CO2 that is there with the water forms carbonic acid intracellularly, and remember, what's inside the erythrocyte? Carbonic anhydrase. It speeds that reaction along. This then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. These bicarbonate ions then are shifted out of the cell into chloride shift, right? So there's a transient rise in plasma bicarbonate that, again, is not really be caused by carbon that's being conserved. It's just this sudden rise in PCO2 going intracellularly into the erythrocyte, converted to bicarbon, spilled back out into the plasma. Okay? Yes.
So this isn't going to happen if it's not acute? If it's like
Correct. This is only an acute change. Okay. And it goes both ways, both from a causing an acidosis as well as causing an alkalosis, Steve. It goes the other way too. But we see it more acutely, typically in the interrespiratory acidosis. That's an acute. Make sense? You know, Mally's got a real good explanation of it, so you can read it. Well, that's your choice. We know that carbonic acid is basically a byproduct of metabolism, or CO2 is a byproduct of metabolism. And that will leave an increase in hydrogen ions if they're not taken care of. And the way we take care of it is we transport that carbonic acid back to the lungs and shift it back the other way so that we have CO2 being excreted through alveolar ventilation. And there's that little shift in the CO2. As the CO2 levels change, the pH levels change. And if you remember back to the oxyhemoglobin curve, this is that Bohr effect that ends up happening. CO2's effect on the oxyhemoglobin curve. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Back to 101. No, 1050 actually. Now, the value itself of PaCO2 is going to vary based upon a couple of factors, one of which is CO2 production. As there's more CO2 that is produced through things like fever, through things like seizures, through things like exercise, you're going to have the carbon dioxide level rising. It also depends on the substrate that is being metabolized, meaning are we talking about carbohydrates, are we talking about fats, are we talking about proteins? Or are we talking about alcohol? We've always got to include that in the discussion. Okay.
Can you include it in your session here too?
Sure. It has an RQ. It has a certain amount of CO2 that is produced as it's consumed.
Can you provide it?
No, not on campus, sorry. And we also know the other component of that is the alveolar minute ventilation. So as alveolar minute ventilation changes, you're going to have an alteration in PaCO2 also. In fact, that's what we call the CO2 equation that you guys have seen previously and you'll become very intimate with again. Just saying. This factor again, because all of these units are different, it puts it in a proper unit. So if I looked at my normal 200, my normal alveolar minute ventilation, something like 4.5 or so. If you do the math on that, it could come out pretty close to 40. Okay. Every time I put this symbol up, people freak out. I don't know why. It's nothing more than this. If I take how much dead space I have on a breath by breath basis, V small d without a dot, multiply it by the frequency, I get the dead space ventilation over a minute's period of time. Subtract that from my overall, and I end up having my alveolar, because this is the component that ultimately is going to control PaCO2, along with the VCO2, obviously. Put more VCO2 in the system, alveolar ventilation has to go up, or PCO2 will end up changing. And on the bottom, it's just showing the fact that as I alter tidal volume, I alter alveolar minute ventilation, I alter PCO2. Okay. So as I approach a situation where my tidal volume is approaching dead space volume, Here I only have 100 milliliters times 2,400 alveolar minute ventilation. It's not going to be very effective in excreting CO2. You're giving me a weird look, Shannon.
No, I'm trying to see.
Oh, okay. You know, they have these things called glasses.
I told you they're wrong. And I don't have time to go there.
Oh, I blame Mary. Okay, we go down the CO2 equation. If I give you 2 to 3, you should be able to solve for the third. Math is fun. Math is our friend. So that rise in PCO2 that we can see can be something where there's a problem with ventilation. Could be something where the CNS is depressed secondary to a drug overdose. Could be something where you have respiratory muscle impairment that doesn't allow for clearance. So I got my COPD patient who now develops a pneumonia, who now develops a temp because of that, now is producing more CO2. In order to increase his alveolar minute ventilation, he has to increase his tidal volume respiratory rate, and he may not be able to do that because of his pathophysiology, the diaphragm not being able to adequately contract, and you end up with a respiratory acidosis ensuing. Recognize that dead space is a component of this formula, so that if we have something that increases dead space, you're going to have an increase in we're going to have a reduction in alveolar minute ventilation in the process. Increase dead space, decrease alveolar minute ventilation. And the one we kind of forget about is the CO2 production. Usually it's a combination of all of them, kind of thrown in together. But we end up seeing the PCO2 rise because CO2, remember, is 20 times more diffusible than oxygen. So CO2 problems, if they're manifesting, it's something pretty significant as far as ventilation is concerned. We can determine that dead space by looking at the, as a rough rule of thumb, looking at the PaCO2 times the end tidal CO2. But remember, let me put it down here. This is the way that we would end up calculating it. I think we had this on the first exam, right? Tells us the ratio of how much dead space is present for the tidal volume yield. We also talked about the second bullet point, the 20-20 rule. As I double alveolar minute ventilation, my CO2 is going to drop. As I double it again, I end up having a halving of CO2. So going from a minute ventilation of 5 to a minute ventilation of 20 will make the PCO2 go from 40 down to 20. So if I walk in my ICU and I see a patient on a ventilator and their minute ventilation on the ventilator is 18, well, let's put it at 20. Their alveolar minute ventilation is going to be, something less than that because of the dead space present. But still, at that point, my PCO2 should be lower than normal. If I got a normal or even an elevated CO2, that means I have a big dead space fraction. Something you guys should be able to pick up on. CO2 production, that VCO2 would go up again because of things like body temperature being elevated, things like seizures, things like burns, and depending upon the food that we're eating, with carbohydrate having the highest amount of CO2 production for the amount of O2 that is consumed. Its RQ is about 1.0. I think I've talked about this before, but we've had patients that we couldn't wean until we changed their feeding regimen, and then they were able to wean. Something as simple as that. We know that elevations in the arterial carbon dioxide level means that my alveolar value must be less. Think of the alveolar air equation. It's got that PCO2 component that's written in there. So what you'll end up having is hypoventilation being the cause of the hypoxemia. And we talked about the change in pH. Because as I increase this value in the denominator, I'm going to decrease the overall pH, assuming bicarb doesn't change appreciably. like that black. Let's change to a different color. How about an orange? Normal VCO2, 200 milliliters per minute. And vaguely, let me just go back through, or not vaguely, quickly, or not. How is CO2 transported? 3 different ways in the plasma, 3 different ways in the erythrocyte. What's that? It's transported as a carbamino compound, where it joins with some protein. It's transported as bicarbonate, and it dissolves into the plasma in what we call PaCO2. So far, so good? It's also carried 3 ways in the erythrocyte, again attached to a protein, but this specific protein is hemoglobin. There's a very small amount, because there's 5% dissolved in the plasma, that means there's going to be 5% dissolved within the erythrocyte in the intracellular fluid. It's going to be the same gradient. It's going to move across that cell wall until it ends up equilibrating as far as the values. Majority of it, though, is transported as bicarbonate because of the presence of that substance called carbonic anhydrase. And this is where that chloride shift comes into play. We end up having CO2 in water, forming carbonic acid. You end up seeing the bicarbonate being formed. That bicarbonate then moves out of the plasma, out of the erythrocyte. This is the erythrocyte on here, into the plasma. Negative value or negative charged ion moving out. Got to have a positive charge, got to have a negatively charged ion moving back in, which is chloride. And there we go. Hartog Jakub Hamburger, yeah. That's probably Swedish, wouldn't it be? I think it was German, actually. But and then bicarb is transported in that fashion. But it's that presence of carbonic anhydrase that is so important for that conversion of CO2 in water into carbonic acid. I should put that there. Carbon dioxide, as we said, reacts with the hemoglobin. Interestingly enough, it's not on the same, not at the same binding site that oxygen binds with hemoglobin at the heme portion. It's more on the globulin portion that it attaches. As the amount of CO2 goes up in the erythrocyte, the amount of oxygen levels go down. So it basically is a competitive exchange that exists where oxygen leaves the hemoglobin molecule, carbon dioxide attaches to it. The increase in the level of CO2 that is present at the tissue level forces the oxygen off. That's the Haldane effect. That's the Bohr effect. As the amount of oxygen gets lower, the amount of carbon dioxide that can be carried goes up. That's the Haldane effect. They're kind of mirror images of each other as far as CO2's effect on oxygen carrying capacity and oxygen's effect on CO2 carrying capacity. And you might remember this picture from Beachy. I think this is out of, it's probably in Egan too, though.
Yes.
Okay. And then it's all reversed at the tissue level. Bicarb moves back into the erythrocyte, gets converted back into carbonic acid, back into CO2. CO2 is eliminated through alveolar minophenylation. Cake. And all he's done here is just taken these percentages of what is transported and yielded how much of that is in milliliters per minute of CO2, getting to my total of 200 per minute. Big whoop. Most of it's bicarbonate. Overall, 63% in the erythrocyte. as bicarbonate. So that ratio between CO2 and bicarbonate must be kind of important, and it is. The ratio shows if I convert that 40 millimeters of mercury into milliequivalents by multiplying by 0.03, you can see that at a normal pH you have a 20-to-1 ratio. When that ratio becomes greater than 20-to-1, say 30-to-1, I have an alkalosis present. When the ratio gets less, I have an acidosis present. Okay? And this last bullet point is just showing if I were to look at my electrolyte panel, if you remember you have your sodium, potassium, chloride, and they have this thing total CO2, kind of gives us an idea of what the bicarbonate level is, since the vast majority of that total CO2 is bicarbonate. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have kidneys that are maintaining acid-base homeostasis also by the excretion of these fixed acids, not the volatile acids. Carbonic acid is volatile. All these other fixed acids that are present. It also, as we'll find, regulates electrolytes within the bloodstream. Specifically here, bicarbonate is the one that we're going to talk about, but it also regulates, obviously, sodium and chloride and potassium. Fixed acids are produced through metabolism, and again, they have to be excreted out through the kidneys, and depending upon multiple factors, you can get an increase in that fixed acid production quite significantly, as a matter of fact. And kidneys will do their best to try and maintain it. There are times, however, where they're overwhelmed. Classic example is a diabetic who, because they cannot metabolize the glucose, they turn to the burning of fats and the development of ketones, and you end up with a ketoacidosis. That pH falls so significantly that the kidneys can't handle the load. And what ends up happening is they turn to the respiratory system to compensate for that metabolic acidemia through hyperventilation. I would like you to know these different acids that are present, the fixed acids, and kind of where they come from. Proteins, when they're broken down, they generate sulfuric and phosphoric. Fats, when they're broken down, as I just mentioned, develops these keto acids, acetoacetic acid and beta-hydrobutyric acid. You can just call them keto acids. I'm happy with that. But these are basically the metabolic pathways that exist when you have different metabolic processes going on. And then most importantly for us is the last one, that during anaerobic metabolism, you only have the ability to utilize carbohydrates. The other two require oxygen. Carbohydrate can be burned without oxygen present, although it's a very ineffective mechanism, not only because it doesn't produce a lot of ATP, but it also produces lactic acid. And that lactic acid can have a profound effect on acid-base balance. And that's on page 205 if you really care. And again, under normal conditions, it's not a problem. There's only a small amount that are produced, so we can handle it. Whenever you have something where that metabolic process has changed or the kidney has become ineffective, you end up having an alteration in the acid-base balance. And what it'll end up doing is it'll either retain bicarbonate ions over time, again, that's the key part, over time, or look at something else. But when we get to the kidney, we'll talk more about that. So there's really three different ways that we manage acid-base disturbances through the respiratory system by increasing minute ventilation or decreasing minute ventilation. So the lungs are one way. The kidneys are a second way, and the other way is through what buffering systems we end up having. And every acid that is present within the body that's normally produced in some fashion, it has a related base that will allow it to go ahead and dissociate. These are called conjugate pairs for reasons that aren't really that important. The degree to which they dissociate, though, is a whole lot different. Some acids readily split themselves off from their associated ion, so that hydrogen ion, that whatever it's associated with, in this case hydrochloric acid, if you look at the arrows, you can see it goes in the direction to the right far more than it goes in the direction to the left. So hydrochloric acid doesn't want to remain in solution as hydrochloric acid. It wants to just be free hydrogen ions. We call that a strong acid. If it was a situation where there was a very limited amount of dissociation, we would call that a weak acid. A buffer solution, or a buffer, is basically something that tries to keep that pH stable. So it tries to limit the degree to which you have these big shifts in hydrogen ions. We talk mostly about acids, but obviously it's with bases also, that these buffers basically try to keep that pH in a very narrow range. And if you look at it from a physiological standpoint, 735 to 745 is an extremely narrow range of hydrogen ions. So what the buffer solution tries to do is convert that strong acid to a weak acid, and strong bases to a weak base, and a salt as an ultimate port. So here's an example. This carbonic acid. It's a weak acid. Very limited amount of hydrogen ions free when this is placed into solution. The conjugate base of carbonic acid is the bicarbonate ion. The salt is going to be sodium bicarbonate. So when a strong acid, hydrochloric acid, is added to our buffer, it's converted into carbonic acid, a weak acid, and a salt. And in this case, it happens to be what we would call salt. It doesn't necessarily have to be sodium chloride, but there's a salt that is what is called a salt as a byproduct. Does that make sense? Take a strong acid, add a buffer, get a weak acid that I can control a whole lot easier. There are multiple blood buffers in the body. For right now, let's just focus ourselves on the fact that we have plasma bicarbonate, that we have some circulating proteins, and these are all extracellular. So these are in the plasma itself. Intracellularly, you got other things going on also. Again, primarily just concerning ourselves with bicarbonate and hemoglobin. So patients that are malnourished, that have a reduction in proteins, are more prone to acid-base disturbances. Patients that are malnourished, that don't have a lot of circulating proteins, maybe their albumin level's low, they're more prone to acid-base problems. The effectiveness of any buffer system depends obviously on the amount of buffer available. For instance, the amount of hemoglobin that is present. We call this effectiveness basically a pK, and it works best within 1 pH unit of their pK. So the bicarbonate pK, the value is 6.1. The pK is 6.1. So really it works better on the acidic side more so than on the alkaline side. And obviously the open system is much more effective because I can just increase minute ventilation. I can't increase necessarily the amount of acid that is excreted through the kidney. And this is just kind of what we looked at earlier, is that open and closed system. So lastly, I think the last topic I want to go through is just this Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. And basically we're just solving for that, the amount of hydrogen ion concentration. And there's that pK, the bicarbonate buffering system, CO2 over carbonic acid, because those are the two components of this acid-base system. And then we do this log of 20, and we get this ugly-looking number, which magically comes out to be 7.4. That was easy. How about we just simplify it? Kidney over lung. I like that. Makes life a whole lot easier. In other words, both of those regulate the pH. Okay, let me just stop there as far as new material and go to one of these case studies that are inside your text. I'll read this because it's kind of hard to read up there, but 52-year-old patient with acute respiratory distress syndrome, so ARDS, is being mechanically ventilated in the control mode in the critical care unit. The patient is being pharmacologically paralyzed, i.e. while he's in a control mode. To facilitate mechanical ventilation, previous blood gases had shown a normal CO2 and PO2 with a severe metabolic acidosis. Could be there's an underlying sepsis or something else going on. Secondary to renal failure. Oh, there you go, that's why. 2 ampules of bicarbonate are administered to correct the metabolic acidemia, and you get the following blood gases: a saturation of 70%, a pH of 7.1, PCO2 of 56, PO2 of 52, bicarbonate of 16, FiO2 of 50%. What do I think about those blood gases? Well, that's a very good assessment. Yes, they do. How would you classify it? We did cover this part of the course, right? It's a mixed acidosis, absolutely. It's got some respiratory component and it's got some metabolic component. Okay, and what else would you like to look at? Is there anything else you would like to? Well, first of all, what happened? We had a metabolic acidemia, now we got a respiratory acidemia. Why? Vent settings did not change. Say that again. You're on the right track. The problem was giving the bicarbonate, right? Sure it does. When this controls this, you end up with this. Carbonic acid. That's going to dissociate into CO2 and water. Where's that going to go? Can't be blown off. I'm controlled. Normally, if the patient was in an assist control mode, was not paralyzed, they would just increase their alveolar minute ventilation. The CO2 in the would diffuse across in the central chemoreceptors, would be stimulated. Vaguely remember that part? Okay. You're going to increase minute ventilation. I can't do it. I'm paralyzed. So we develop a respiratory acidemia, and basically just also in the process fail to eliminate that hydrogen ion, and we still have the metabolic acidemia present. Whenever you add bicarbonate, whenever you give a patient bicarbonate, you're in essence putting CO2 into the system. Unless we have adequate alveolar minute ventilation, you're going to make the acidemia worse. Think about codes and how rarely we use bicarbonate nowadays. Hopefully. Please tell me you're not zinc sodium bicarbonate used at codes. In the old days, everybody gets 2 amps of bicarb. What? And it used to be protocol. Now it's like you rarely see bicarbonate used because of that exact reason. Okay? Great little case study. So what would we do with this? How am I going to fix this? Increase the alveolar minute ventilation, absolutely. How? Oh, that's next time. Maybe. Okay.